Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening for this conversation with Rashid Johnson. As some of you probably know, we are hoping to open Jean Dubuffet Brutal Beauty this May at the Barbican. And the starting point for the exhibition was really just how frequently Dubuffet came up in my conversations with artists like Rashid. And so this strand of the public programme really just pays homage to Dubuffet as one of the original artists and goes to some of those figures to help us think through why he's had such an enduring legacy. So I'm sure for most of you, Rashid needs next to no introduction, but for the uninitiated, you originally studied photography, which I always think is interesting at the Art Institute, and maybe we'll come back to that in Chicago. But I think quite quickly your practice expanded to include quite a range of other media, from sculpture and painting to recently filmmaking, and of course also installation. I think Rashid has become truly internationally renowned for a very complex, multidisciplinary practice that explores themes such as cultural identity, philosophy, and materiality in a rich matrix of meaning making. Rashid is represented by Hauser and Wirth, and I hope a few of you might have had a chance to see the amazing show that was at the London Gallery in December in that little slither of a window in which we could see real life exhibitions in London, which has sort of been keeping me afloat and lots of us ever since. So the format for this evening is super simple. I have a few questions that I want to ask Rashid, and I'm hoping he might help me think through. And then we'll be really glad to talk about things from the audience. So put those in the chat. Do it as we go along, and we'll try and incorporate them into the flow. Do it at the end, and we'll incorporate it then. We are going to keep the event very strictly to an hour, partly for Rashid's schedule and partly for save everybody from digital fatigue. I'm really glad that we have Orla with us, who's live captioning this event, which is a reminder to me to immediately slow down how quickly I'm speaking. It is a fallible process, so if there's anything in our conversation that you don't follow or you'd like us to repeat, again, just put it in the chat and we'll be happy to do that. Okay, so that's enough housekeeping. Rashid, I wanted to start really just you've spoken for a long time about your interest in Dubuffet and what he might sort of mean to you very practically in the studio. But do you remember when you first came across his work? How, where, when?
I do. Eleanor, it's great to be here. It's great to be with everyone today and get a chance to talk about some of my work and some of the influence that Dubuffet's had on my project. He's an artist who's incredibly important to me for many reasons. And to your question, I absolutely remember the first time that I felt like I understood I was looking at a Dubuffet. And you mentioned that I studied at the Art Institute Chicago, which I did. And my first experience with Dubuffet was at that museum. And I was walking. It was earlier than my graduate studies. I was an undergrad. I was 19 years old, and I was walking through the museum. For sure, I was beelining to the Franz Klein, which was for me this really epic painting and a project that still very much stays with me in my thinking and my work as well. But I'm sure I was beelining there. And I remember seeing a young Black man who was walking with two other people who he was obviously friends with, and he was explaining to them who he thought Dubuffet was. So he was kind of working as kind of a grad docent, for his friends, more or less. And he described Dubuffet as in terms that I've never heard Dubuffet explained since. And went into these really kind of what he imagined were these personal interpretations of what Dubuffet was thinking, etc. And I remember just being kind of a fly on the wall, trying not to be creepy and stand near them. I wanted to hear this guy talk about this work. And It turns out it was one of the portraits Dubuffet made of the kind of the salon of intellectual portraits. I think in the late 40s around, and I remember just listening to this guy wax poetic around this picture, and just and you know, it kind of gave me two different opportunities. One, it opened up space for me
and we
to
have an image of that actually that we can bring up an image of one of those. You
that's
carry
excellent.
on.
Yeah. It opened up to me that you could kind of interpret an artwork, our series of artworks, an artist's history, in whichever way you saw fit. And I knew this guy was taking liberties, and I knew that he was kind of expanding on aspects of Dubuffet's work that may or may not have been prescient in Dubuffet's actual interest. But I just, you know, it opened up that space for me in a way that I was extremely intrigued by. I think that, yeah, it may have been that portrait.
So
does that portrait belong to the Art Institute Chicago?
This one doesn't, but it was shown in Chicago in 1951. So it was one of
when he did
so
the
this is from this exactly.
That's a very
so this
famous
is from
lecture.
Yeah, and I was thinking about that. It's funny actually, until you started talking about those portraits, I hadn't directly thought about you in relation to that whole Chicago lineage. But of course, you know, Dubuffet gives this lecture at the Arts Club, and you know, it's one of those events where famously kind of everybody says that they're in the audience, but you know, I think about 14 people actually signed the visitor book, and one of the only people who I know was definitely there was Leon Golub. And so I think there's a really interesting kind of lineage via him and some of some of the Chicago imagists and other kinds of figures.
You have to remember, Dubuffet also had a really substantial public sculpture in Chicago. Dubuffet's like impact on the Chicago school and on the Art Institute and on several artists who came from that Chicago space is pretty substantial. He also did quite a bit of work with Richard Gray Gallery, who often was showing his work when I was a student and had work, and I'd become friendly with Paul Gray of Richard Gray Gallery, and so he had an extensive knowledge of Dubuffet's work. So it was really present in Chicago, both in the institutions and the galleries and in public space. So
I just love the story of the docent. Like, it kind of reminds me of when I was once sat on the top of a Route Master double-decker bus, and there was this father and son, and the father was just kind of giving his son this tour of London, but just like everything was wrong. I mean, it was amazing. Like, not even wasn't even wrong, because like to say it was wrong implies a totally different kind of semantic understanding of what right and wrong means. It was just completely invented. It was like, you know, he was pointing at Fortnum and Mason's and being like, and this is the MI5 headquarters. And just like, but it was amazing. It was like for 45 minutes. And it really, like, as somebody who grew up in London, it was like, you know, completely wonderful, because it also, you think, maybe that is the MI5 headquarters, you know, maybe they've been like hidden amongst the marmalade all this time. And I think
I remember just loving it. I mean, at one point he said that he believed Dubuffet was a closeted homosexual who was dealing with his inability to come out of the closet and to express who he really was. And I remember thinking,
but you know, the trippy thing about that is that actually there's a tiny, like, only if you've spent the last 3 years studying Dubuffet like I have, there's a tiny bit of Kent Minturn's doctoral thesis in which he also puts forward that exact theory, that this is to do with repressed sexuality, and that he has this relationship with Max Jacob, and that he has this failed first marriage, and that actually a lot of his aggression and animosity in terms of image making comes from that. So there's something kind of like wonderful about it's so wrong, it's actually like completely right.
this guy may have been onto something.
But do you feel, you know, like you were saying, when you first encountered Dubuffet's work, that was before you'd even done your MFA studies. I mean, do you feel like you see something different in Dubuffet's work? Does it speak to you differently now than it did then? And if so, do you have a sense of how?
honestly, I'm constantly learning from his project, and experiencing in a different ways. Sometimes, and at different stages in my project, I've been really influenced by some of the kind of naive picture making of the project. There's a time, and that time may even be kind of continuing now, where and you and I have spoken about this, I think, in the past. The kind of interest in graffiti has been interesting to me, and Dubuffet's project, and his interest in graffiti, his interest and my interest in urbanity. So at different stages, and of course, the way that he uses materials, the way that he kind of honestly, breaks so many rules as far as how he mixes things together, whether it's kind of adding sand or, kind of challenging the medium in ways that are in some ways unexpected. And probably a lot of that is him coming to being an artist at a later stage, and not being as obligated to some of the philosophies and rules as had been set forth prior, and him saying, well, I'll just do it this way. So there are all these different characteristics that continue to influence how I see his work, and how it's changing me.
Just picking up on the graffiti thread, because I think it's it's a great thing to think about. It's a great thing to think about right now. I think this is a photograph that Rashid took from the long series of images he was taking of graffiti in Paris, right from the Dubuffet first finds those images in the 1930s. We actually have this as a graphic within the show, because I think it's so powerful. Actually, maybe Rachel, you can bring up the Grand Paysage Noir as well, which is a painting that he made very much in response to his thinking about graffiti, and specifically his thinking about Brassai's photograph of graffiti. And I think for me, I first came at Dubuffet. Yeah, so here you go. You can see this is an amazing painting that's in Tate's collection, and luckily in the opening room of the show, and remains something that, if I think about the works that I'm still learning from and looking at really differently, because you learn, I was saying to you, we're in the install at the moment, and paintings like this you've been looking at for so long in reproduction, and then suddenly you see them in the flesh again, you kind of re-encounter them, and there's a whole lot going on that you kind of didn't really think about or fully engage with. I mean, the violence of the mark making is one of them, that there's maybe that's back to the sexual aggression, but like you become physically aware of what it has taken to make this painting, and it's the most basic thing in the world to say, but until you are physically in a space with it, that energy is completely bound in by the flatness of the page. And I think you feel that, certainly I feel that with like really powerful graffiti in the city as well. You become conscious of, the graffiti that Dubuffet is looking at, particularly in Paris, is often carved into the walls. This isn't necessarily spray painted, this is really like etched into the surface of the city. And there's that sense of like something that goes back to the graffiti in Pompeii, something that's completely ancient. Absolutely. And also that sense of it being very, very individual, very personal, and yet completely anonymous. Like,
well, it's also, it's quite raw. And having grown up in a city myself in Chicago, and been a part of a graffiti scene from a specific position, and what that position kind of, or how it kind of is unpacked, is there were the graffiti artists, who were the folks whose ambition was to kind of decorate the city, and to be kind of these urban angels who spread their artistic vision onto the topographic urban landscape. And then there were folks who did what we referred to at that time as gang graffiti, which was like what was more kind of scrawled, more with considerably less aesthetic ambition and intentionality, but with a real consistent consideration of the delivery of a message, which was essentially like, we are here, right? And so when I think about the graffiti that Dubuffet gravitated towards and really kind of influenced a lot of his project, it is that scrawling, that scratching, that kind of sinister, almost scary, information laden mark making, as opposed to the more philosophical and aesthetically driven and artistically cognizant process of translating mark making in the street. So I'm super interested in that more raw strategy that says more or less, this is the message, right? Like this message is intended to be delivered here and is not to be co-opted by a concern for aesthetics, a concern for beauty, a concern
Well, that
for,
there is its own aesthetics within that, and that
absolutely.
aesthetics is like really powerful and needs to be channeled in its own form. I mean, somebody has asked the question about how does this relate to Basquiat, which is, you know, a good question. And in a way, for me, you know, I come to Dubuffet backwards, because in a way I kind of, you know, broadly knew about his work, but part of the reason why I'm doing this show is because there hasn't been one in 50 years. You know, I haven't seen loads of these paintings that are in this show. And that's partly kind of COVID connected and whatever. But when I was working on the Basquiat show, it really became like very, very apparent to me just how big an imprint Dubuffet had made on Basquiat's practice. And one of the things that always frustrates me about when people speak about Basquiat in relation to graffiti, they tend to kind of lump him in with that like Charlie Ahern, like wild style thing.
Completely different scene.
Misleading. You know, it's like you look at the Samo project, and actually the thing that Samo is most consistent with is exactly what you're talking about, which is that like 70s politically inspired, like, you know, you could see it in Northern Ireland in places, like just literally black lettering, right, you know, really crude, really raw, really visceral. It's got nothing to do with
message delivery. I mean, from in Basquiat's hands, it almost becomes almost more of kind of a Dada strategy, which is kind of delivering a message, but allowing that message to be quite poetic and to be easily interpreted in different ways by anyone who comes across it. And that's such an interesting aspect of what he does, but he also doesn't have any of the characteristics of the graffiti artists of the time, as far as kind of the loopy line making or the filling in of symbols. He uses a completely different iconography. I mean, it prays at a very different to a very different God than a lot.
But I think he
would have with graffiti.
I think the lineage with Dubuffet is partly going back to Brassai, and is partly going back to the sense of like a kind of graffiti, you know, because a lot of graffiti that Brassai is documenting is either interwar or it's in the midst of the occupation of Paris, you know, and there's a series that Dubuffet makes called The Message, which will be one of the first sets of works you see in the show, and they're so small and they're so killer, and they're these tiny little works made on newspaper, and he's made them on French and English newspaper, and he's just scrawled these messages that he's taken off the walls. So they say things like, George, the key is under the shutter, or I've loved you always, or, you know, I don't believe that, or, you know, they say these kind of like simple everyday phrases, but things that often resistance fighters had written on the walls for other residents and friends and neighbors and lovers and family to read, you know, that sense of the script of a city being like etched around it. It's, you know, it's a kind of extraordinary moment in time. And I think then you think of the context of New York in the late 1970s. Again, people forget that New York in the late 70s probably didn't look so different in certain ways to dilapidated Paris.
No, it's incredibly tough if you think about being downtown and then what's happening on the Bowery, where Basquiat, you know, has a studio at one point. It's really quite rough. The graffiti's everywhere. You know, you've had quite a bit of white flight. You know, you have the AIDS crisis. I mean, there are kind of all these different moving parts that make New York really. I can definitely see how you can make that comparison to Paris at that time. And it's interesting how we look at Versailles today, which we look at Versailles with a macro lens more often than not. And we think about him kind of depicting the beauty of Paris and and the documentation. I mean, not totally dissimilar from someone like August Sander, who would say like, this documentation, here is the place, and obviously was incredibly conscious of the quality of light to which he makes images. But Brassai, if you take more of a micro view at the work, does kind of zero in and make a really prescient critique of Paris at a time where it's really quite complicated, and there are a lot of kind of inner workings and a lot of uprisings.
Visceral. Yeah. And I think, you know, often the first question people ask, or the first question people should ask is like, why are you doing this show now? And like, you know, it's so often because of that, because there's some kind of political charge. You know, when I worked on the Basquiat show, it was because it felt like, unfortunately, there were aspects of Reagan era politics and the kind of birth of the yuppie and like extreme disparity of wealth. And there felt like a lot in that context that really resonated with what was going on now, and a kind of urban alienation. But all of that is to go back to materials, because I want to take a minute and ask you just a bit about materials, because we have this shot in the opening of the show, which Robert Duano took, which is like Dubuffet, like, I love it. It's like him, the kind of the tinkerer. It's like the maverick in his studio, and he's got like a cake tin with gravel and like funnels and like, you know, every kind of paint pot, piss, all of it just like laid out on the table, kind of ready to go. And there's quite a lot of like culinary metaphors he uses as well, because he very much sees himself as a cook, not a chef. You know, he doesn't have formal training. You know, he's been to the Academy Julian for 6 months, and it gives him this real fluidity in terms of materials. You know, that we've got some video footage of him like in Vence, like in this sort of deserty land, and he's just like taking handfuls of sand and just like putting them in the pocket of his trench coat. But there are parallels that I see with your work there too. You know, I've seen you in the studio with like saucepans and like melting down black soap and shea butter and all these other kinds of materials. Do you still feel you're expanding materially? Are you still kind of finding yourself in like aisle 3 of the Walmart being like, could I melt you?
That's a very funny that's a funny reference point. You know, I've always been interested in materials that you could find in more of a common shopping experience. I was early on kind of turned off by the art supply store. I didn't like that it wasn't necessarily welcoming or familiar, and that there was this kind of sense of these magic materials that then somehow turned turned into something else that maybe would be difficult to understand, et cetera. So I was really interested in using materials that were quite familiar, whether it was mirror or shea butter, things that went on the body, things that had multiple meanings, and things that could be signifiers and hold space in multiple locations. So there was a familiarity where you say, "Oh, I understand this material," and it in my hands and for my purpose had transformed into something else, holding kind of this dual meaning, and allowing space for these kind of dichotomous understandings of how and why I was employing the materials. And so for me, kind of having this opportunity for materials to carry multiple purpose kind of gave me space to explain, you know, where I was coming from and what the subject matter was that I was interested in discussing, while making smaller and more direct moves, and then allowing, you know, room for interpretation as well. And so in some ways people have suggested, oh, you know, that makes it more complicated. In my estimation, in the way that I see, I think it makes it way more simple when you use something that people are familiar with in a different with that they have different experiences with. And so yeah,
It must
that
feel so
aspect of Demey's
liberating.
project. Yeah. I mean, it is. I don't feel any allegiance to, you know, materials that people have traditionally used. And so, you know, it gives me space to say, okay, what do I want to perform with? And what do I want that to look like? It also, it's challenging because at that point when you're ascribing so much meaning onto the materials that you use, that you have to be quite deliberate in the choices that you make. But in the end, for me, it gives me space to be more clear and more honest within my approach.
Okay, so we're talking about shea butter and marshmallows and all the other extremely eccentric materials you're using, but I can see the anxious red behind you, and I believe these are made on linen with oil paint. So what does that then feel like when you then come back to these but do you feel like Giotto? Do you feel like you're kind of suddenly having to engage with this ancient tradition of painting?
I think it feels really, really intentional in my hands, to be honest, because of the antecedent materials that I've used, because of the things that I've focused on and have been so present in my work in the past.
Anxious red. We've got a picture just of one of those so that anyone who can't see them so well in the background.
Oh yeah, this is just kind of the pictures that are in the background, but no, in my hands, I think based on my history, it makes you kind of question why then would I come to this quite familiar art making material at this time, and I think it really speaks to my interest in kind of digging into that history at this moment, especially in 2020. And this is a color that I made myself that I call Anxious Red. I work collaboratively with some paint makers here in New York called RF Paints. And the process of making this paint was quite interesting because there are so many aspects of paint making that I hadn't taken into consideration previously. And I hadn't really thought as much about kind of some of the science behind how a painting, how a paint comes together. And my first interest was a concern with color, and I wanted to get this color that I thought really kind of spoke to the urgency of the moment that I was feeling early in the pandemic. But what really came to fruition that was even more kind of challenging and interesting for me was thinking about viscosity and transparency in the paint, and so how it moved around the surface and how much you could kind of enter and be rejected by it. So the transparency, and then the kind of opportunity that it had for opacity. And so there's all of this kind of opportunity in exploring kind of all three of those elements and trying to understand like how it would perform, and then using this kind of very toothy linen, and then using this oil gesso, and kind of putting all of these materials together and recognizing the kind of natural sophistication that they have, while at the same time trying to do something that really kind of struck the chord of the prescient, struck the chord of the time to which I was making those, which was, in the heart of the pandemic, while experiencing a tremendous amount of fear, confusion, and not exactly knowing where and how we were to move forward.
So we're speaking about fear and confusion, and so this is one of your anxious men, which I think the Anxious Red were kind of born out of the anxious men and the anxious audiences, and then the broken men, and I wonder how much is there a cathartic element to making these? Is there that's a kind of awful question in a way, but it's one that's kind of really genuine for me. Like, do you feel like there's a working through of something when you're making these? Especially, I'm thinking with those anxious reds where you've got that kind of real repetition of imagery and that sense of a kind of compulsive movement to the way in which they're made, and also just physically, I look at those broken men ceramic pieces and the weight of those must be monumental, whereas these are pieces that you can, I imagine, really commune with kind of one-on-one.
Yeah, none of them are light, but no, it's a really good question, and I would say, in all honesty, that most of these works were born of a cathartic intention, and I never, if I'm going to be completely honest, I never thought that my work would be dishonest. I never thought that it would. I never thought that I had the intention to explore kind of in depth my own thinking, illustrate my own concerns, be conscious of a time or a period or a set of feelings, or the collective conscious, or any of those aspects that I think that these works actually really do devote themselves to. Coming up as a young artist, I was very interested in the canon. I was very interested in history, transforming and negotiating my relationship to those things. My investment was considerably more in conceptual practice and philosophy, and how critical theory both touched on an art object, and was able to deform and make transparent or opaque what an art object, what its intention was. So this work came to me really as a lightning strike, and it really dealt quite a bit with where I was psychologically and emotionally. And I was dealing with things both personally, with fatherhood. I had gotten sober 7 years ago, so I was kind of negotiating this new world through these much more clear goggles, or what some people would refer to as a new pair of glasses. And so I was kind of thinking about the world through those lenses, and I was I was also kind of looking around and seeing what America and the world looked like at that particular point. And there was the police shooting of Mike Brown. There were all kinds of issues with the borders and immigration issues, and some kind of collective understanding that we were dealing with a world that felt different than the one that I thought I had understood previously. And not to naively suggest that that world was in any way fantastic, but I felt like there was something on the horizon that just didn't that felt more toxic in a way.
And actually, this has been there very powerfully in your work for quite a number of years. And I think it's also one of the frustrations that there can be a kind of discourse in the public realm as if 2020 was the moment when Black Lives Matter occurred. And of course it didn't. Like, it predates that by years. This goes a long way. And I think also in terms of your engagement with politics, but there was, I'm thinking of something like the New Black Yoga. I'm thinking of a work like that in which you were also addressing anxiety, and you were also addressing the idea that, like, there you were in Berlin, and obviously there was sufficient anxiety for someone to be like, hey, Rashid, you should really think about yoga. Like, people have been doing this for 2,000 years. Like, there are answers, friend. But, that film is in one sense quite po-faced and like quite elegiac, and like, is it 16 mil you've shot it on? Like, it's gorgeous.
That film is 8mm actually.
Eight. I mean, it's unbelievable.
Most of the films I've shot subsequently have been 16, but that film was,
and it's like, and the light on the beach and the movement of these men, but it's also like hilarious. It's so funny because, again, it's a bit like the guy on the top of the Root Master, right? Like, none of them are doing yoga. Like, I don't know what they're doing, and it's great, but none of it's yoga. And so it's, it is a bit like, oh, and here is MI5's HQ in Portland and Mason, and that's sort of wonderful too. But some of that humor has simmered down, and I wonder if that's partly just because of the circumstances of this last year, circumstances of isolation, maybe also a kind of like strength and vulnerability, and being like, what, fuck it, like, this is how I feel, and I'm just gonna completely, I don't need to have that satirical edge. I can also make work that's very direct.
Yeah, maybe it doesn't necessarily, maybe I'm not feeling as much that needs to be mediated through humor in the way that at times I had kind of allowed it to perform previously. Early on, there was this different time in kind of comedy and exploration. It felt like we were living in a world that was almost a tad less scary. In
Yeah.
a way. And I don't know if that's just me, and it very well could be. I don't know. But I was really, especially coming out of grad school and in the early 2000s, up until like 2008 or so, 2009, I was really interested in the Chappelle Show and a lot of things that Dave was doing. Comedy it played this really big role for me. It was something that was super interesting and made complicated ideas more palatable in a way, and allowed for these ideas to kind of like in a rhizomic kind of transitory way kind of like run through the veins, and be kind of seen and understood without feeling like the work was didactic. Because I've always really, even though I think that there is something, as I get older and into different stages of my life and my understanding of an artist's practice, I think there's something really quite magical about the didactic performed correctly. There's something kind of amazing about it. There's some real intentionality there. If you're like, this is what I meant, and like I'm trying to teach you this thing. And my work has never really enjoyed that space because it kind of
Yeah, you're too
vacillates.
ambivalent. Yeah.
I'm also like, I don't know, maybe, I don't know. I mean, like, this
Maybe you
feels
just need
weird.
to maybe you just need to commission the right kind of contemporary Kenneth Clark figure to just come in and be like, listen, this is this is how I read Rashid Johnson's work. Maybe you're just allowing too many people who indulge this kind of creative matrix of meaning making.
I love the idea that meaning can unfold through the parcels and pieces that belong to an artwork. I mean, you showed An Anxious Man earlier. There's so many pieces in that work, whether it's the white tile background that's grouted, which for me makes reference to this Russian Turkish bathhouse, to which I spent a lot of my grad years in reading Deleuze and Guattari and
thinking about the rhizome.
Yeah, think about rhizomes and all this deconstruction, and the gift of death, and so like kind of making reference there, and using this material which is black soap and wax, which is black soap and which is a West African material, so it kind of takes you through this transatlantic journey, reappears on this white tiled surface, this interaction that then kind of creates a whole different set of interests and concerns. And so all of it becomes kind of mediated through the material, the line making, the idea that I kind of conjure this character and that I just call it an anxious man. The fascinating thing for me about this experience is that not unlike Dubuffet, these are not necessarily skilled images in their intention to reflect someone specifically. And I call it an anxious man, and everyone just says, "Oh yeah, okay."
Yeah.
Yeah. No one has ever questioned me.
Like, did you want to have a bit more cheekbone kind of definition?
Never.
Were you thinking about a bit more of a kind of, maybe the skull form could change a bit?
Be like,
No.
it doesn't really look so anxious. Like, no one has like, so the way that titles then can perform in space, right? Like, this owes an incredible debt of gratitude to conceptual art, and to artists like Dubuffet, who says, this is Dr. Wilson Jacobs. And everyone's like, that's Dr. Wilson Jacobs. And like, I'm like, this is an anxious man. And people are like, this is an anxious man. Like,
don't you think it's partly because it's got, don't you think the clown quality is connected to that too, though? Because it's like, the like big eyes and the mouth, and like it, for me, like they really, I mentioned to you the other day that I watched Blue Velvet, and like, I was like looking at the clown figure and feeling really like freaked out about kind of slightly like Lynchian anxious man figure. I mean, there's a lot in that
great
film
use of color in that film. Great use of color. He really understands green. He understands green in a way that I think no one has understood green. And Yeah, great film.
But the clown
I
is
like
all
Flesh.
about the facade. It's all about the face. So in a way, you kind of you don't you don't look at a clown's face and be like, your left eye is bigger than your right. You're like,
Yeah, you just kind of accept
back
it.
off.
But this idea, and I bring Gustin into this conversation as well. This willingness to kind of accept something in its depiction, right? Thinking about the idea of the figure, of the depiction of some sort of specific gesture, some sort of specific sensibility, some really kind of intentional interpretation of a person, place, or thing, without necessarily the ambition to follow the rules of how
Possibly
one
in
would.
Dubuffet's case, animal, vegetable, and mineral. Like pretty much everything he makes is all of those simultaneously.
Absolutely, and he gives us titles. He gives us space to unpack those things. Theaters of memory, right? And so, like, when we're given agency, right, and there's so many different ways to which we can be granted agency by an artist, whether it's through materials to which we have an opportunity to interpret. In my case, I use shea butter, and I say, you know what shea butter is, or you don't know what shea butter is, or here's space to explore what it is. Now think about it in use in this form, in this context, right? So here's agency. Here's a title that gives you agency. Here are all these kind of breadcrumbs, are these opportunities to interpret it that don't then disallow me the opportunity to really viscerally and aggressively gesture, mark, deal with my relationship to the poetry that I want to make, to abstraction. So it's like I can simultaneously produce something that's complicated, visceral, physical, but also kind of still allow for content that's deliberate and intentional and gives you guidance as to how to participate with it. And that's one of the things, and Dubuffet, even especially later in collage, gives us so much of that. He's like, here's the city, and here are the characters who live in it, and they're found partially on my studio floor, with failed pictures, with successful pictures. Here's a building, right? Like, and we stop the questioning, right? And we're allowed to ask more existential quality questions rather than the simple question of, is that depicted? Is that what it is? It's like, throw that out of the window. Like, we know what it is. Now we can do this other deep dive and allow the artist to like explore and push and bully material. And that's like, for me, the legacy piece in Dubuffet, and there are other artists, who I would give credit to in that space as well. But that really like opened the door to psychological examination of themes that really, push the agency of the viewer to explore and to multitask in the way that they participate within artwork.
I mean, I love the description of bullying the material, because I think there have been no better words put to the violence that Dubuffet did to his materials and to the whole notion of verisimilitude. I mean, it's just like, you want to play this game, you're going to need to throw that out the window. You mentioned the theatres of memory, and those are the works, for people who aren't familiar, that Dubuffet's making in the late 70s, and they're shown predominantly at Pace Gallery in New York, and they've been seen a bit since then. It's actually, we had a great show of the Theatres of Memory at Pace in London a few years back, and this is one example of them. And I wanted to use it actually to put in a question that someone had put from the audience about preliminary sketches. So it's always quite an interesting question about, how much, as we're talking about, how much premeditation is there, and also not to be fooled by the rhetoric. So of course, Dubuffet wants to make everything look incredibly casual, and like he's basically just like lifted the underside of a bin and then used it to like print on a piece of paper. But the truth is, for these works, for instance, he had installed a massive sheet of metal. I mean, you can't see here, but these works are enormous. Some of these are about kind of 2 meters across, at least 3 meters across. So he had this massive sheet of metal installed in his studio so that he could kind of move around with magnets all of the different aspects of a composition like that, and then he'd memorize it all in order to then be able to remove everything and glue it all kind of onto the canvas. So essentially no preliminary sketches, but a hell of a lot more premeditation than you would have expected. What's your process, or does it vary just enormously depending on what sort of thing you're embarking on? Do you keep a sketchbook?
Thank God for modernism, because somehow it has led us to have artists try their best to make things seem more simple, right? Could you imagine a world prior?
Yeah, they were all talking about rhizomes.
So, it's interesting for me because I do prepare in some ways. I prepare, whether it's through sketch and thinking about how I'll move. In some ways, my project can often be quite physical. So sometimes my preparation is almost stretching. I always say, for me, I don't paint with my fingers, and I haven't really kind of I don't use gestures that are like kind of contained within the hand. I use gestures that tend to be almost more physical and like a whole body experience. So it can be as like some of my preparation, and it kind of goes into the humor that I put into some of my films, like Black Yoga, which is like these guys doing what is fake Tai Chi. And then I call, and then just like contemporary dance and maybe some things that allude to yoga. Like, so I think about kind of how I move my body in whole. So when I'm making things like The Anxious Men, they're made on the ground, and it's kind of the physical pouring of the black solvent wax, which has been melted. It's poured onto the sheet, and I'm like moving like a whole body in which to do it. So the sketch for that is me physically in space, kind of moving my body. And if you were to see me prepare for it, you're like, what is this lunatic doing? It looks like a dance. It looks absurd. It looks ridiculous.
If we came to Long Island, we wouldn't find you going for a daily COVID walk. We'd find you like out on the beaches, just, doing your moves.
Possibly.
To be able
Yes.
to like.
Yes, like preparing, like it's a different kind of practice. If you were a basketball player, you like practice shooting. I'm like practicing kind of like
maybe
these
to do
larger
this with writing. Like if writing's my practice, is it just like in my wrists? Should I just be?
You should be doing something. Yes, you should be doing. Maybe you should be doing piano. You should be moving your hands and understanding.
Just like getting into it, and eventually the words will just start like flying out.
But so there are lots of different things in preparation. But yeah, there's the kind of physical preparation, and then there's the mental preparation.
It's a beautiful image, though, that like, a sketch is not necessarily something made with a pen and a piece of paper. There are many ways to sketch or prepare for a piece. And
no, that's it. I've been sketching a ton recently and a sketchbook. And it's really,
so I do that too. It's just less of a cool answer.
Just in the last year, more than any, I shared a bunch of drawings and sketches recently with a project for the Museum of Modern Art. If anybody's interested in looking that up.
Cool. Okay, great. And somebody else was asking something which is kind of a complicated question. It's about beauty. Are you ready for beauty? Yeah. Okay.
I love beauty.
So
I'm a Libra.
Yeah. Oh, well, yeah. So your work to me bridges the divide between beauty and academia. Let's think about them being on poles. Possibly not wrong. E.g., material choices and literary and cultural source materials, making it accessible to everyone across the board. Is this important to you? And what parts of Dubuffet's work do you see this in? So I guess what's being framed here is like this kind of dichotomy between what you were describing as being like very conceptual, very cerebral, the like thinking aspect of your work, but also, the works are ravishing. Like these are really gorgeous things to kind of look at and behold. So beauty, not a dirty word in your vocabulary.
It's not. It was a challenging word to begin to employ. I'll be honest. It was I come to being an artist in the late 90s. And you mentioned that I studied photography at Columbia College and Art Institute Chicago. And I studied photography because that's where the smart kids were. Like really no bones about it. I come to art at a time where kind of critical and conceptual practices were the way to make things that were interesting and complicated. My mother was an academic. I had a real intellectual curiosity. Painting and sculpture in the late 90s, especially those that had any relationship to beauty, were often quite dirty in the way that people considered them. And so it was complicated. Now, the reason that was so hard for me is that I'm an aesthete, and that I have a deep and significant interest in material.
My name is Rashid, and I am an aesthete.
Yeah,
and
and really, it's really challenging. It's taken me my lifetime to come to terms with aspects of my interest in beauty, my interest in poetry, my interest in aesthetics, both materially and critically. It's like it's one of the hardest things about my project. I think younger artists today have absolutely none of these burdens. I think that they're like, oh my God, our things have to be quite beautiful. And I was coming from a place where I was like, no, these things have to be quite relevant. And what does this have to do with Karl Marx?
Yeah.
Right. Like,
yeah.
And so
what is its relationship to the capital?
Yeah. What is this relationship to labor? Right. Like,
and alienation.
Where does this all fit in? So like, and I still have a deep commitment and investment and kind of critical and more kind of philosophical aspects of art making. So that divide, the one that you're pointing out, the ask of the question is pointing out, is one that I think is still dirty and complicated and confusing for an artist like myself, but that I've kind of finally committed to just allowing those things to coexist and kind of flourishing in the ugliness that can come as a result. I'm happy to be there, and I'm happy that that's how they're seeing it.
It's interesting because I think Dubuffet was very anti-intellectual, mostly because I think very much connected to the experience of the war and like, where did that get you, clever bastards? Like, look at the mess around us now, kind of thing, And so he was super interested in like also linguistic projects that kind of broke down language and played with the kind of just like absurdity and chaos and, really getting away from rationalism, basically.
Absolutely. There's this play with semiotics in his work that's like super complicated.
Is let's this just thing this humanism?
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, is this thing? Are we just calling it that thing? And are we comfortable in that space? And I love that about his project. And it's something that, it's in an interesting way, Dubuffet and how his work becomes aesthetically stimulating is not dissimilar from how things become stimulating over time. I mean, I was with someone recently and we saw a work of Donald Judd and they said, oh, this is so beautiful. And I thought to myself, would Donald Judd have thought that he was making something beautiful? Right? And like, so what is our relationship to beauty, right? And how does it evolve? Because this overarching ambition to kind of qualify an artwork is beautiful, right? And to use that word in our lexicon so consistently in order to interpret it, that like our standards for beauty are ever changing and evolving as a result. Wow, what a beautiful Felix Gonzalez Torres work. What a beautiful Flavin installation. What a beautiful Dubuffet painting. All things built and considered and brought to life without beauty being their ambition, I'm imagining, but are today interpreted using that kind of term to characterize it. It's deeply complicated.
It is, and it's funny because like, so the show has this title, Brutal Beauty, and that was partly because I wanted to make a joke about the Barbican and brutalism, and everybody's like one side of the divide or the other. They're either like, God, brutalism, it's incredible, it's a modernist utopia, or they're like, it's the ugliest building I've ever got lost in for half of my life.
But some people love brutalism. They think it's beautiful. Like, what the hell are we supposed to do with beauty at this point? Like, how the hell are we to
who knows
unpack
what
beauty?
it is? But one of the reasons why I wanted to do it was also to reclaim an idea that I think a lot of people think that Dubuffet wanted to make deliberately ugly images. And actually, he wanted to what he called to rehabilitate scorned values. You know, there's something so sweet about it. You know, he wanted to encourage us to see that beauty flourishes in all of these places where we least expect it. It's like back to the underside of the bin lid again. You know, he's there being like, but wait, guys, there's something ravishing over here too. So it's not that he wants to completely get away from beauty altogether. The truth is, he's also an aesthete, but he's just one that wants to believe in this expanded vocabulary or other places to see it.
I think that there's something really wrong with an artist who doesn't have an interesting and complicated relationship and ambition to participate in beauty. It's just. Do
you know what I'm going to do, Rashid? I'm going to cut that out and I'm going to make a digital ad out of that. That's going to be like, you know, some kind of GIF doing the rounds as of you watch tomorrow morning. I think there's something wrong with any artist. So somebody was saying, no, I'm on team aesthete too. Somebody was saying, and this is a hard question, but it's an important one. Do you have any advice for emerging artists about what to do or not to do with trying to show your work and approaching galleries, representation, etc.? You know, it's a big question, but it is important. And there's a lot of artists, I think, especially now, very conscious in the conditions that things have kind of changed a bit this last year, and in some ways maybe for the better. Do you have an instinct on that?
Yeah, you know, I think the best thing to often do is be the best version of yourself in the way that you approach these kinds of situations. So if you are a more bold person, a more kind of ambitious person, I think that you should perform kind of bold gestures, whether that's talking to people at an opening or saying, hey, my name is blah, 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 and I make things. I would love to have you over to my studio. But if that's not your nature, you're not going to do that well. So if that's not your nature, then, you know, continue to send out emails, make connections with people who are able to create those kinds of opportunities and create those connections for you. Build the kinds of relationships that are honest and clear, and that you make clear in your interactions with people what your intentions are. I always think trying to be cool is just wrong, unless you're cool. If you're fucking cool, then it's gonna work for you. You're gonna be cool. It's gonna be great. I wasn't cool. I was just kind of a serious guy who really wanted to have opportunities. So I would be like, hey, I'm here with my things. You know, like, what should I put them up on the wall, or you want to look at them first? So, you know, doing the best version of who you are, and then look at other examples of where you've been successful in life. Like, as far as finding partners, how have you been successful finding a partner? You know, like, what have you done there that worked, right? And how have you been successful in school or not? And just kind of following your path of success in other aspects of your life is a real guidance to how you're going to have success in the art world. You're not going to do anything terribly different than what you've done previously to have success in different aspects of your life, if that's helpful.
I think that's such good advice. And like when I was a baby curator, I felt really distressed about it, because people always made you feel like you should be like doing a show in like a railway arch, and I didn't know where there were like available railway arches, and
I don't want to do that.
You know, I just wasn't that person. I was like, I just want to go and visit artists and like write a bit about their work, and like, but I always had this kind of nagging feeling about the railway arch, and you know, I've never done a show in a railway arch, and it seems to be okay. So
do the best version of you in all things. I know people who are like, if you want to curate a show at Tate, you should go work at the Tate. If you want to, like, you know, if you want to do like whatever you want to do, you should just do it the best way that you can do it.
Oh, well, I think that is very good advice. And with that, I'm going to leave you because you've got 1 minute until your next appointment. And I promised people no digital fatigue. And we've laughed and thought about the dystopia of our modern world and materials, and slipped in the suggestion that marshmallows might be a material you should think about experimenting with. But no one really believed you were in Walmart.
Thank you, Eleanor, and
Thank
thanks
you,
everybody
Rashid. Thank you
for
so
coming in.
much. Thank you for joining. It's honestly such a pleasure.
All right, be well.
Bye.